Until not long ago, TV news was reported in teams. A reporter and videographer would head out into the field to get a story together, watching each other's backs. That has largely changed in the TV news business since the advent of the video journalist, a one-man band who can report, shoot, sound record, and even edit a news story, working solo in the field. Video journalists, often younger and more multi-skilled than many of their colleagues, bring a lot to the table. They save newsrooms enormously on costs, but they also take on more risks in working on their own, and they're more vulnerable. We saw this vulnerability very dramatically in the US earlier this year when a reporter in West Virginia was hit by a car during a live shot. She was okay and amazingly kept going with her report, but the accident spotlighted the dangers of doing the job. I'm Michael Depp, editor of TVNewsCheck, and your host for Inside the Media, the show that looks at the business of the news and the people who make it. This week, we look at video journalists, the work they do, the risks they take, and how they're changing the way that TV news tells stories. My guest this week will help unpack the profession of video journalism, how it's changing TV news, and the risks particular to this kind of reporting. Laura Brown is a video journalist with CTV News Atlantic based out of Fredericton, New Brunswick. Silas Brown is a video journalist for Global News, working out of its Fredericton bureau. And Hank Price is a columnist for my publication, TVNewsCheck, and a former general manager for a number of television stations across the United States, where he joins us from today. Welcome to all of you.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Laura, describe what exactly a video journalist does. What's different about a video journalist's job compared to how TV stories were traditionally reported and in many cases still are?
Well, I think actually you explained it really well off the top. We do the job from start to finish by ourselves. So we pitch our stories in the morning. We have a good understanding of what we can gather during the day. We make the calls. We then set up the television camera and the tripod and the microphone and the lighting if that's necessary to do an interview. Then we take those interviews back and we put them on our laptops, or in the case of CTV, we use iPads. And then we put it all together and we try to get it to our 6 o'clock deadline to make it for air for the television show that night. So it's different in the sense that you don't have that extra body. And I mean, like in the 90s, there was more than just two. There was 3 or 4. There was a field producer sometimes, there was a sound producer, and then it went down to 2, the camera operator and the reporter. And now it's down to 1. And for CTV's sake, I think we started doing this in the early 2000s when it was ATV prior to CTV. That's when it started.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So many hands used to be involved, and now there's just one pair of hands often with these stories. Silas, what are the advantages of reporting stories as a video journalist? What do you like about working this way as a reporter?
I think the fact that there is only one hand kind of on the content is an advantage in some ways. The fact that you are shooting all of the material, you are gathering all of the interviews, so you know exactly what you have and where the story is going. It gives you an enormous amount of control over what you're doing. You don't have to work with somebody else to choose shots for an edit. You know where those shots are usually in your footage. You know how to go and get them. You often know exactly where the clips are because you're operating the camera. You can take time codes down as you're going through. And so that amount of control that you have over the story is definitely very nice, and can be a little bit odd, I think, for a lot of video journalists when they do work with a second person to kind of give up some of that control. But of course, there are trade-offs both ways, but that's definitely one of the main advantages of doing it all yourself.
So you kind of get to be the auteur of the story, the director of the whole thing. And in your training, I imagine as a student journalist, you have to pick up a lot of skills that traditionally people would sort of segment into in journalism school. They might study one element, but not all of these things. And all of that was presumably part of your education.
Yeah, it's when I went to journalism school, we had one large unit in I did a 1 year condensed program, and we had one unit that was over the course of 6 to 8 weeks just called video, and that's where I learned all of it. The standing in front of a camera, the standing behind a camera, and the sitting behind a computer, which are really the three main parts of what we do as VJs, or at least the most visible parts that make it into the story. Of course, there's all the other things that go along with being a journalist of making the calls, doing the research, and setting all of those things up that happen more or less behind the scenes as well.
Laura, among your own colleagues on air, how many would you say are VJs?
All of them right now. So we have, hosts and anchors, obviously, but every reporter has now made the adjustment to becoming a video journalist within the last 5 years. And that includes all of my Halifax colleagues, every bureau in New Brunswick, as well as the bureaus in Nova Scotia. So everybody does it now.
And what about you, Silas?
Yeah, it's the same at Global as well. We've transitioned entirely to video journalists. We have one camera operator left who works out of Halifax, and will help out as needed if a reporter needs help in the field. But for the most part, we're all video journalists now.
So it sounds like if you want to be a television journalist in Canada today, you'd better have all those skills. You better know how to work a camera, how to use editing software, how to set up your lighting, as well as all the reporting skills as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that deters some people from the field, unfortunately. But I absolutely think that it is the name of the game these days.
But of course, it's not only television too, because a lot of other kinds of news outlets produce video reporting. You don't need to be a TV station. You can be at a newspaper, and a reporter could go out and record video to accompany their story, or audio. So it's not like these skills are just applicable to television.
I would very much agree with that. Even when I worked briefly in print after I graduated school, there was a hunger and a desire for video content that I would often produce for them. And it got me a lot of work actually right out of school, being able to do this sort of stuff and having these sorts of skills.
So Hank, let's get some historical perspective around the position of the video reporter, which I should note in the US is called the multimedia journalist, or MMJ. Hank, you were managing stations around the time that we first started seeing these kinds of reporters in the US around 2008 or 2009. What was happening then?
The recession was a disaster for profits. The station I ran, the profits dropped 50%. Now, I worked for a private company without debt, so we were okay. But most stations were owned by these mega corporations, and they were in real trouble. They had to save money. And the quickest way to do that was to fire all their photographers. And that's what many of them did. And they, instead of having $40,000 cameras, they went down to Best Buy and they brought $6,000 or $7,000 cameras. They fired the maintenance people who maintained those $40,000 cameras. It was a cost-cutting move, and it was very rocky. And it was interesting that you look at the age of Laura and Mark. Many of the older reporters lost their job because they couldn't make the transition to this. And so you ended up with a much younger reporting staff. Now, over time, the equipment manufacturers caught on. They began to design equipment for one person, technology, things like LED lighting, which saves a lot of weight, came along. The universities, and we just heard a lot about that, all teach this now. And so the entire system, from the time you start in a university all the way through your job, is set up with the MMJ. What no one ever thought about was the fact that this might be dangerous. Is there any risk to a person out there?
Yeah.
It just didn't occur to anyone. And it was a way to save money, and reporters can't afford to complain.
So it essentially arose out of practical financial concerns. It's a lot cheaper to send somebody up by themselves than two people or even three when you had an audio recordist out there in the field as well.
Had nothing to do with journalism at all.
But Hank, it was also the case that the technology was coming along to enable this one-person TV reporter to exist, right? We weren't talking about heavy over-the-shoulder cameras or microwave trucks being necessary to report from the field anymore.
Well, yeah, today an MMJ can have a camera about this size, between the two sizes that Laura said. It can easily go live over an LTE system. So it's right there in their hands, and very lightweight tripods, very lightweight lighting systems. And all of that technically can be done by the person. So it's not a technical problem as long as the person is trained and wants to do that. And as we heard from both of these young folks, there's actually a lot of enthusiasm because you have creative control. So it's not a terrible thing. What it does, though, is it requires so much work that the reporter is not able to concentrate on just reporting. That's what we've lost. You've also lost someone whose whole life revolves around great photography. And when you put a great reporter and a great photographer together, that's when you can get magic. And that still happens, but it's not the day-to-day at most stations.
Mm-hmm. It is difficult to be good at both things, isn't it?
It is. And I think there's some terrific work that MMJs, video journalists, turn out all the time. But I think that's tough to do.
Well, let's look a little closer at this gear. Laura, tell us about the typical gear that you carry out in the field now. What's in your kit?
So I started back in 2012, and I was using this camera at the time, and I'm still using this camera. It's a larger camera. You can put it right over your shoulder, and you can hold the microphone out like this. And I love this camera because I grew up on it, so to speak. I really enjoy using it because I think that the lens is very, very strong, that you can get really good shots, even if you're far away. So I like depending on it for things like good interviews, or if I'm far away from a scene and I need to see it closer up, it's really good for that. But CTV, most of us use this now, these little Canon cameras. There's like 2 different or 3 different styles of these that we use, and they are much lighter. This would be about 2 pounds, and this one's about, I don't know, Silas, would you say like 16 to 18 pounds maybe? I don't really know exactly, but they're heavy. And it's so much more versatile, right? Like the only thing I'm not a fan of is trying to do any scrums, or what we call like when you do have to have something on your shoulder and you're interviewing somebody for a long period of time. It's hard to put this up and steady it. But I enjoy using both. I'm kind of old school, and I really like the old camera.
Now, the older camera has the light built in.
Yes, it does. It's right up here.
Yeah.
It's not a strong light. I think Silas actually has a really good one for his camera. But it works. It does the job.
And the camera's not the only thing. Well, Silas, what have you got camera-wise? What are you working with?
Yeah, I am also working with, similar to Laura, I have one of the larger size cameras still. Global is beginning to transition its VJs away from these cameras into still Sony's, but some of the smaller Sony 4K cameras, which are much lighter and much more versatile in some ways. But these, like a lot of what Laura said, the lens on these cameras are fantastic. And as heavy as they are, there is a level of quality that comes with them, and not using digital zoom, which some of the smaller cameras do.
So you're both able to work more nimbly. You're literally lighter. Laura, how does the viewer benefit from this? How do these tools improve your ability to do your job in a way that viewers would notice or appreciate?
I always say I wanted to report first. So I wanted to be a journalist before anything else. And I'm now VJing because I feel that is the only way I can do what I love to do, which is report. So I think the viewer still has somebody who is maybe even more determined to get the story out because they are responsible for the product from the very beginning to the end. It's like, I don't know how best to put it. Like it's my baby every day. I want it so bad to look the best it can be and to sound the best it can be. But more importantly, I want the story to be the best so that the viewer can comprehend and understand why it was important to spend time on that story that day. So I think that the viewer, well, I definitely admit I didn't get into this because I was a great videographer or a great photographer. And I still don't feel I am. I've learned a lot over the last 10 years, but I think that the viewer still has somebody who is loyal to the story, and it almost to a fault, because we're now willing to do almost anything to get the story out.
Mm-hmm. Hank, you've been somewhat critical about the advent of this position, but is there an upshot for viewers as you see it? Do they gain something in this kind of storytelling?
No, it's hard to find an upside. It really is, because what Laura just said is absolutely right. It is about the story. It's about the journalism. And you do what you have to do to get the story out. That's what she does. That's what Silas does. They're getting the story out. If you've got two people there, there's no question. If one of them is an expert in photography and editing and the other can concentrate on the story, there's just no question you can do a better job. Mm-hmm. I'm sure Laura would take that if she had that. Why would she not?
Let's talk about safety and vulnerability, because there is most certainly a downside to reporters working this way. As I said briefly at the top of the show, there was an incident back in January where a young MMJ, a video journalist named Tori Yorgi in West Virginia, was actually sideswiped by a car while she was doing a live stand-up. She was okay, but this prompted video journalists all across the US to spotlight how dangerous this job routinely is. Silas, tell us about the kind of everyday dangers, or at least the vulnerabilities that you face in working this way.
When you're alone and you're just staring into a camera, that's where all of your attention is, which makes you very vulnerable to the outside environment that is away from your peripherals. When you have somebody behind the camera who is watching that environment, as well as making sure that the shot is going well, but say you're doing a live hit, or even just recording a stand-up for a packaged piece, you have no idea what's going on behind you. You can be approached. We saw that a lot during the trucker convoy protests that happened, over the last number of weeks. Where reporters were being harassed by people. People were approaching them, getting in their live shot, yelling at them, chasing them out of places. There's that level of vulnerability and danger, but even just getting into the car every day, living in a winter place like New Brunswick, the roads are difficult often, and you are alone and you are under pressure to get from point A to point B as soon as you can to get places to report. And so you really need to ensure that you're taking care of yourself in every single way. And it's a lot of these sorts of things, along with the pressure of the job, that can lead to a lot of the burnout, which I think is something that doesn't get talked about with VJs enough, as well as a secondary danger to people's mental health through this job, is also bearing witness to some of the awful things that we have to, but then the pressure and intensity and just breakneck speed of the job that is what used to be the job of 4 people can really cause a lot of people to burn out, and some people leave the industry. The shelf life of video journalists is unfortunately not very high. A lot of people move on to other things or end up leaving the industry because it can be very difficult.
So your situational awareness is impaired almost all the time, especially when you're doing a shot. You've got burnout issues. You're worked really, really hard running around doing this job. Laura, I understand from talking with a number of female reporters in the field that they are particularly at risk, if not necessarily from physical harm, although there's sometimes that. At least they're more likely to be targeted for verbal abuse than their male colleagues. What has been your experience with that?
Oh, I mean, I can't really talk, I guess, for my male colleagues, but I have been yelled at from moving vehicles many, many times, to the point now where a colleague of mine actually got yelled at this week. And I had told her to, to inform our boss. We have like a bit of a protocol. And I also said, you can tell police, because I used to report it every time it happened, so that they can statistically keep a record of how many times this has happened. But the majority of the harassment for me is online right now. I find Twitter a very toxic place, and I've actually stepped back from tweeting during the pandemic because of just how much online hate is out there for journalists. And I find that is, I guess I would say, on the increase, and I think even worse for female reporters.
I'm hearing from a lot of reporters that the dangers or harassment that they face have gotten worse in the past couple of years. And it seems that's tracking with your experience, Laura. Silas, are you also finding that to be true?
Yeah, I mean, I came into the industry, about 4 years ago, and it seems like there has been a bit of a turn in how people view the media. There's always been distrust in people who were angry and had a bone to pick, but it's become it's coming at much more of a fevered pitch now, and much more of an aggressive tenor, and it's not uncommon to be told that you should die on the internet while you're just trying to do your job, right? And I certainly I've seen abuse, but it's nothing, as you kind of mentioned it, as Laura spoke about, that my female colleagues have to deal with a lot of this, so much worse. People of color and women are facing just the terrible brunt of some of this anger that is racist and gendered and misogynistic a lot of the time. And it's really unfortunate.
It's astonishing just how cavalier people can be about approaching reporters in the field and just yelling something, how little they'll think of that and how often that will happen. But again, of course, online, they feel they can be more anonymous about that. Well, for the good and the bad, video journalists seem to be here to stay. Hank, given that in most cases, they don't even need to go into the newsroom anymore. They can report and edit directly from the field now, and they do very often. How do you see this changing, Hank, the TV newsroom of the future?
Well, it's going to be more decentralized, as you have pointed out, because it can be. I think the future is something that we need to try to change, because the future is to continue to do what we're doing, which is less people doing more jobs as technology enables that. Now, that's a good thing if it allows you to do a better job. But under the best of circumstances, journalism is a dangerous business. So to send people out by themselves makes it an even more dangerous business. I don't think it's worth the risk to save the money that we're saving.
Laura, how do you see video journalists continuing to change the newscast, especially, as I said, since you don't need to go into the station anymore? And it used to be that everyone met in the station every morning. There was a lot of collaboration that happened inside of the newsroom itself.
I will say I've noticed a lot of change within my management over the last 6 months to a year or so when it comes to safety. And I just wanted to make sure I noted this, because when we were covering the freedom protests that were happening in New Brunswick, CTV did send us not only an extra camera, like an extra person, but the person was responsible for doing our camera work. And we also had some security as well. So I do think that there's a better understanding of what's happened, but I don't necessarily think we need to have a second person every single story, but it's really good to have them when those moments, when we can try to be proactive in those moments that might be a little bit more of a risk. And I think most news agencies have recognized that over the past couple of years. But I miss that collaboration. I think that COVID has made it difficult to be in a newsroom and to, over the last 2 years, we've all been working from home, at least at CTV. So I do think we'll get back to that. Like I do have an office, and it's with my radio colleagues as well. So I think we'll get back to that, but the last two years have been difficult on that part of the industry. And I don't know if we'll get back to it full time. I think there'll be more of a hybrid version where some people are working from home and some people are in the office. And that collaboration, like you said, that team atmosphere is definitely missed, and I think it strengthens the product. So we'll see in the future if that stays the way it's been over the last 2 years.
And Silas, you'll get the last word here. What do you think about how VJs will continue to reshape TV news?
Well, I think many of the things that we've talked about how nimble we are, how able we are to produce content in the field and on the go, is going to help hasten the decline of the 6 o'clock supper time newscast. I don't think that that's going to stick around much past probably the next 10 years. I think we're at the point now where, barring CRTC guidelines in Canada, which do require stations to broadcast a certain amount of news programming every day, that's not how young people are getting their news anymore, but they are consuming video content, and figuring out how to get that to young people is something that VJs are always going to be involved in. We're a position that exists because the industry has been cut to the bone. You can't cut too much further past where we are. You always need boots on the ground. You always need people to bear witness, and so we'll always be there. And no matter what form that next piece of video type of journalism takes, it's going to be video journalists who are going to be providing that, and maybe our existence also begins to hasten what comes next.
An intriguing note on which to end, because that's all the time we have for this conversation. Thank you to Laura Brown of CTV, Silas Brown of Global News, and Hank Price of TVNewsCheck. Until next time, we will take a closer look at how the news works. I'm Michael Depp, and this has been Inside the Media.